Summers as a kid, for me, were full of bike riding, fort building, and family vacations. And I loved summers as a kid, but even as a high schooler, my summers were pretty free, pretty open, like a 3-month vacation. Maybe I wasn't fort building, riding bikes as much, but I still had that free time. But when I moved into college, anybody who has been to college knows that your summers change after you start college. For me, summers became that time to make as much money as I possibly could, to pay down as much college debt as I possibly could. One year, as I looked toward the summer, I was able to find a job as a custodian for a school, and that was just the evening job, just a part-time job. So I had the day hours to find another job. And I heard that UPS was hiring. And so I got the application for UPS, and I applied. But there was one requirement on that application that I was struggling with. It was spelled out very clearly on the application that this job required an employee to lift 75 pounds. I wasn't so sure that I could. And I wasn't so sure that I wanted to find out if I could. But I knew that if I were to be called back for an interview and they saw this scrawny 130-pound kid, they would ask that potentially deal-breaking question, can you lift 75 pounds? Well, I was called back for an interview, and I was ready for the question. And the question came. They looked at me and had to ask the question, can you lift 75 pounds? And so, I smiled with the best charm smile I could, and with confidence to try to aspire or inspire confidence in me that I didn't even have in me, I said, I'd like to think so. I remember that the interviewer responded the same way you just did, with a snicker. But she didn't push it. She didn't press it. She hired me. Both of us made really bad decisions that day. We've been talking about success and the secrets to being successful. We are often advised that if you want to be at the top, you got to convince the others that you belong at the top. You have to sell yourself. You have to sell yourself. No one else is going to do that for you. That's what a resume is all about, right? But by all means, you don't put everything on the resume. You put all the good on there, and you leave them guessing about the bad and the ugly, right? We've been following the story of Esther. Here's a beautiful young woman who wins a beauty contest and becomes queen of the Persian Empire. The surprise in the story, that which she keeps off of her resume, is that she is a Jew. She keeps her religion, her nationality, and her God a secret. Those things she believed could sabotage her chances towards advancement. If you want to be successful, you have to sell yourself, right? And she wasn't the only one in the story. In fact, if we look at all of the major characters within the story, it seems that everybody is doing the same thing. But there's one character in particular that seems to especially own this art of arrogance. His name is Haman. I hope you have been following the story over these weeks, reading between Sundays the story. If you have missed out on any of the lessons, I encourage you to find those on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel or even our podcast. You can listen to the audio there. The short of the story is that this arrogant villain, Haman, has become the most powerful noble in the whole empire, and he enjoys the recognition. So when Esther's cousin, Mordecai, who has raised her, refuses to bow to Haman, Haman can't handle it. It's discovered that the reason that Mordecai won't bow is because he is a Jew, and so Haman gets the king to agree to kill all of the Jews, not just Mordecai. Of course, King Xerxes doesn't know that even his wife, the queen, Esther, is a Jew. They aren't that close. He kind of has her around because she's just nice to look at. It's a sad story. The Jews, though, are going to be killed. So Mordecai says to Esther, "You're our only hope. You gotta go tell the king, that you're a Jew. Maybe he'll save all of our lives if he saves your life. Maybe he'll listen to you." So at risk of her own life, Esther realizes that she can either just continue to hold this pointless and powerless position as queen and think that, that means she's been successful, or she can begin to lead and live into the purposes of God, which is what it truly means to be successful. And so at this point, we see something change within Esther, and she begins to understand maybe what success really means. Namely, that she needs to understand success as God does, not as others do. Haman's not on the same track as Esther. He hasn't come to that realization. And he continues to promote himself at all costs, and it doesn't end up making him successful. The short of this sermon today is this: self-promotion will ruin you. It's a popular path, though, that many people take. But there are a few points in this story that I think helps expose the truth that our efforts to self-promote are not helpful. So I want us to take a look at that today, asking the question, answering this question perhaps: how do we push against the temptation to self-promote, to sell ourselves? And here's the first item here. First, acknowledge that the self-promoter will never be satisfied. I think Haman believed that his value came in what others thought of him. So when everyone was bowing to him, it felt good. But when one person refused, he didn't know what to do with that. It kind of killed him inside. That's all he thought about. He didn't think he could really live as long as Mordecai was living. Now, Haman was second only to the king himself, right? Certainly more powerful even than the queen. She had a position, but she had no power. But it wasn't enough for him. So when Queen Esther invites Haman to join her and the king in this banquet, he's in his element. I mean, look at me, right? He couldn't be happier. Or could he? See, we know he could have been happier because those who live to self-promote themselves are never satisfied. And we see this in the story. See, Haman left the banquet happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. It wasn't enough that he had just come from a dinner with the king and the queen of the entire Persian Empire. Someone with a healthy emotional intelligence, I think, would be able to see one person who wasn't their fan and dismiss that one person for everybody who was. But he couldn't. It ate him up. Nevertheless, even though it filled him with rage, Haman restrained himself and went home. That is the one good decision that Haman makes in this entire story. Right there. But he is steaming mad. He goes home, and it says this, calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. See, if my happiness is contingent on how you feel about me, and I'm not sure that you have good feelings about me, I will boast so that you can be convinced that I'm important, so I can feel important and feel good about myself. This is the trouble. What's with what he's boasting about, though? What's with boasting about how many sons he has? Seems an interesting way to self-promote. But we do this kind of thing. I'll take credit for the success of others. If my kids fail, I'm not to blame. But if they're successful, that was good parenting. Something tells me that Haman probably should not be promoting himself as the father of the year just yet. If we're self-promoting, we will grasp at whatever we can to elevate ourselves. What's also interesting about what he is saying here is that these are things that his friends and his wife already know. He's just recounting his resume. They know his resume. Why is he showing off his resume before them again? It's not for them. It's for him. He feels the need to let them know how important he is. But then he goes on. There's a new item to the resume he wants them to know about. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But catch this. All this gives me no, say the word. All of this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Ask yourself, do I live to be recognized by others? See, that's a tough place to live, because the truth is, even if you try to convince yourself and others of your success, you will never please everyone, will you? You know that, right? If you live to be recognized by others, you will never be satisfied. If you've read the rest of the story, you are also aware that Esther did not invite Haman to honor him. She was inviting him as a plan to expose him. But he saw it as a great thing. Look at me. And it kind of reminds me of a story that Jesus told. Remember when Jesus was invited to a banquet? And the story goes this way. When he noticed how all the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. I love this. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. All the other seats are full. You've got to go all the way back to the back because you were in the place of honor and you didn't belong there. He says, instead, you should do this. But when you are invited, take the lowest place so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. And then he ends with this statement. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus is clear. Self-promoters will be humbled. But those who assume the lowest seat will be the ones promoted, at least in his kingdom. Isn't that the kingdom that matters? When considering how to be successful, it seems counterintuitive, but what Jesus is saying is assume the lowest seat. Assume the lowest seat. That's not Haman's style. Maybe Haman had good sense on that day when he was invited to the banquet to assume the lowest seat, but I don't know that. But even if he did assume the lowest seat on that first day, we see what he's saying the next day. And we get this clear picture that Haman is not one to assume the lowest seat. Because remember, the next day, Haman comes in, he's ready to get Mordecai killed. He's out in the court, and the king hasn't slept all night. He says, I need some advice. Who's out there? Haman, come in here. I need to ask you a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Well, and Haman, where's he at? He's not taking the lowest seat, right? He's like, well, who is there that the king would want to honor more than me? I was invited to the queen's banquet yesterday and later today. He's talking about me. And so he takes the high seat, doesn't he? And he gives this answer to the king. I've got a great idea for you, king. This is what you ought to do. He answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have him bring a royal robe the king's worn, a horse the king's ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Well, this is sounding good, right? Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor. Lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. He's like, boy, this is sound. This is good. Whew. How's it end? Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So what just happened there? He didn't assume the lowest seat. What if he had? Might it have looked differently? I don't know. Haman did it. How embarrassing, right? I mean, he was all over this idea when he thought he was the king's favorite. But when he found out he wasn't, humiliation. And he was mostly sad because he had just told everybody that he was the king's favorite. It's much better to be honored for your humility than to be recognized for making too much of yourself. Does that make sense? For all those who exalt themselves, remember Jesus said, will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. According to Jesus, success is not found in self-promotion, not in elevating oneself, but in humility. And you know the best way to live humbly? How do we actualize this in life? You know the best way to live humbly? It's this. Promote others. See, instead of promoting yourself, you promote others. That's how you live humbly. How good are we at that? Well, we'll say it this way today. Aspire to be a giver, not a taker. Some only have in mind to take. They only ask, what's in it for me? Haman was all for his plan on how to honor the king's favorite as long as he was the favorite. There are takers. Haman was a taker. And then there are givers. Before Esther ever talked with the king about the horrors Haman had plotted, you remember what her first request was? of the king, what her second request was of the king? When he said, hey, whatever it is, what's your petition? I will give you up to half my kingdom. Remember what she asked for? She said, will you receive a gift from me? Right? She said, will you come to a banquet that I prepared for you? She's preparing a table in the presence of her enemies. Success is not always in the receiving. Remember, Jesus said, again, it is more blessed to give than to receive. She was going to ask. She had a really big request. But before she would receive, she chose to give, even to her enemy. God's design, listen, God's design for success seems counterintuitive. Jesus, remember, we referenced this a few weeks ago, I think. But Jesus told his disciples when they were arguing about who was going to be in the first seat. Remember what he said? He said, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last. But it's not just in assuming the lowest seat. He adds, and the servant of all. In other words, don't just assume last place. Aspire to do what those in last place do. Serve. When Esther finally presents her request to the king, she does so without even a hint of self-promotion. Rather, she does so as a servant. Listen to her words. If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. One part of the story that we've not referenced yet in these lessons is that Haman had made a deal with the king, King Xerxes. He said, if you'll sign this edict to kill all of the Jews, I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the king's treasury. That amounts to 375 tons of silver. That's a lot of silver. They had not been sold as slaves. He had bought them to take their lives. And you see the difference? And Esther says it would have been different if he just wanted to make us slaves. She said, I'm willing to be made a slave. She goes on to say it this way. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. I'd do that. I want to serve. I'll willingly sell myself to you. Service to the king. Remember, before Esther even went to see the king, she knew that legally it was a death sentence to go before the king. And she said, if I perish, I perish. Right? She was willing even to give her life. She was humbling herself to the point of death in order to provide life for others. She is willing to give her life. While Haman, on the other hand, wrapped up in self-interest and an overzealous desire for revenge, desires to take the lives of thousands. Thankfully, Esther has wisdom from God and demonstrates massive amounts of humility in leadership in these moments. She stepped in to save her people. But you know how the story ends with Haman? Do you remember that the people who were closest to Haman could hardly wait for him to mess up? Do you remember that piece of the story? Before the king even announced the death sentence to Mordecai, the attendants had covered his head with a hood and suggested the method of death that the king use. You remember that part? understand this. If you are a person who is always self-promoting, you probably have more enemies than you need. You have people who are waiting for you to fall. There are people in the wings that just can't wait for this boastful, arrogant, villainous person to be out of the company or whatever else, right? You hear what I'm saying? And maybe you look at this and you say, well, this whole story is a little bit extreme, as far as an example in self-promotion. And maybe it is. But do we have tendencies to promote ourselves? Maybe we aren't scheming to kill another person. Maybe you haven't come up with an idea of how to kill off an entire nation. That's good. But probably your efforts to make too much of you is a turnoff to others and not helpful in your success. We know it's a turnoff to God. Because God says this, the Bible says it in a couple places. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the what? The humble. God opposes the proud, but he does show favor to the humble. What if we were to acknowledge that self-promoters are never satisfied? What if we were to begin to really assume the lowest seat? What if we could aspire to be a giver, not a taker? What if when it came to success, you didn't feel the need to sell yourself, to over-evaluate your skills and abilities and try to become bigger in the eyes of others, but instead you humbled yourself, became the servant of others? What if you stopped living to sell yourself and began living to serve the one who has purchased you with his own blood? Wow. Maybe we could say, put a new meaning to let's sell ourselves. Let's become the slaves. Let's become the servants of others. Let's become those people who live to serve God. Maybe we would say it that way. But at least maybe we need today to say, we can sell ourselves short. Sell yourself short. Don't make more of you than you are. But you are something. Right? You are made in the image of God. He has purposes for you. Sell yourself short in regards to all of these people, but know who you are in Christ. And pattern your life after the one who has shown us what humility really looks like.